Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be here. Given what we learned from Andre about what happens to the brain when we sit for a long time and the way our brains change, I'd like to invite you to just stand up for 1 minute, wave around, and sit down again because it's warm and it's after lunch and our brains are being affected by this reality. So thank you very much. I am going to invite you to go into rather different territory for the next 20 minutes. Very brief, but my work is really on Paul's anthropology and Paul's understanding of the human person, personhood, and which is a very participatory understanding of personhood. So it moves us into rather different understandings of the personal agent. And that's what I really want to focus on. And I'm putting that in conversation in my larger project with some work in neuroscience and particularly experimental psychology on, and developmental psychology on understandings of personhood. I am not a scientist. I'm a bit intimidated to be here at MIT, but I just claim the rank of amateur in that regard, and I'm happy to be corrected and instructed by all of you, whether here or in conversation later. There are very few New Testament scholars working on Pauline anthropology in the first place, let alone on that topic in relationship to neuroscience. And it's very interesting that the ones who are tend to have bought into the idea that science means one has to have a purely naturalistic account of reality and exclude any supernatural causality. And so I'm trying to do something different than that in conversation with and argument with some of these other Paul scholars. So my topic is Paul on personal action and the intersubjective self. And that term intersubjective comes from the work of a neuroscientist. Many different people now use that term. I will put this in conversation with one neuroscientist, Vittorio Gallese, who is, I'll talk about briefly. Okay, so what makes an action personal? That's my focus. Now in the movie, You've Got Mail. Anybody remember that movie, You've Got Mail? All right, so Meg Ryan plays an independent bookseller named Kathleen, who's being put out of business by a mega bookstore around the corner. And the executive of the mega bookstore, played by Tom Hanks, is named Joe. And Joe and Kathleen have a budding online romance. And Joe knows that the woman he's falling in love with online is the woman he's putting out of business in reality. Kathleen does not know this. So Joe defends his business decisions, which are quite ruthless, by the mantra, it's not business, it's personal. He keeps saying, it's not business, it's personal. And he gets by with that until he actually goes to see Kathleen after he's put her out of business. And he takes her flowers. And he says, it wasn't personal. And she says, it was business. What is that supposed to mean? I am so sick of that. All it means is it's not personal to you, but it's personal to me. It's personal to a lot of people. What's wrong with personal anyway? And he says, nothing. And she says, I mean, whatever else anything is, it ought to begin by being personal. What makes an action personal? Now, one answer would be to say that it's an action done by a personal agent. And that just shifts the question to the qualities of the agent. Is the agent an individual substance of a rational nature? Is he a self-conscious, self-determining agent who can watch himself and narrate his own actions? Neither description captures the implied understanding that Joe and Kathleen share about what it means to be personal. No, for both of them, personal implies interpersonal. A personal action is something that affects other people as persons. And further, when Kathleen says it ought to begin by being personal, she implies something more. Human actions are always done by personal agents who are such agents precisely in and through their interpersonal connections. She's reminding Joe that he also is a person whose actions affect other people and vice versa. So within the human economy, at the least, in this understanding, all actions are personal and indeed interpersonal. Kathleen knows this, but Joe only begins to face it when he moves from virtual reality to the face-to-face encounter. Now, You've Got Mail came out in 1998. Fast forward to the present, to the world of Match.com on the one hand, and of burgeoning neurobiological discoveries about the essential embodiment of human identity and social embeddedness of human identity on the other. Never have so many people sought a sense of personal connection via the internet than the face-to-face, and never have scientific discoveries so compellingly established the link between the self, the body, social relations, and the larger environment in which the person is embedded. So what's going on? What is the person? What makes our actions personal in this way? So not so long ago, the core self, or the essential self, was thought to reside in an incorporeal mind detached from the vicissitudes of the body. Personhood was defined in terms of the autonomy, and it may still be defined in this way in many circles. Autonomy, rationality, self-awareness, and self-determination of the incorporeal mind, or core self. Such thinking is still extant today in many places, including popular culture, widespread belief in an immaterial soul that escapes the body at death. But the flip side, of course, of this dualism is a denigration of the body. And this is often laid at the feet of Christian theology and of the Apostle Paul. Now, is this the case, or does Paul indeed have a more integrated understanding of the person as both embodied and socially embedded? More pointedly, in regard to our topic for today, how does Paul understand persons as agents or personal actors? What might that embodied personal agency look like and signify from an understanding of personal action? Well, these are big questions, far exceeding the time limit for today's talk, which is quite brief, and I'll try to be very brief. I want to juxtapose in a very brief overview the theory of mind of one neuroscientist, Vittorio Galesi, with the puzzle, and it really is a puzzle, of personal agency in Paul. And along the way, I think we'll find some surprising resonances as well as differences. So are you with me with this so far? It's a real different world of discourse we've moved into. So I'll be very brief on Galesi, and I will invite correction from the scientists in the room, if need be. He's an Italian neuroscientist who was involved in the early discoveries of, quote, mirror neurons, very contested theories around this in Italy, and who has become a spokesperson for philosophical implications of these discoveries, all of which, as we know, are hotly debated. He grounds his theory on research in two areas. One is studies of infant imitation done by Andrew Meltzoff and others in the 70s and thereafter. This is not neuroscience, it's studies of infant development. And the other is his own studies of canonical neurons and mirror neurons in the premotor cortex of monkeys, and fMRI studies of human brains. And he talks about the ways in which mirror neurons famously fire, both for the actor doing an action, say grasping a cup, and for the one who observes that action. So canonical, or not canonical neurons, but mirror neurons fire in the observer and in the actor. This was discovered in Parma, Italy. And he suggests that these neurons generate an implicit, automatic, and unconscious inner simulation or representation of behavior for the performer and the observer. And furthermore, he posits that this creates this is his terminology, I'll put my scare quotes up for it, a shared space of embodied experience, opening up between observer and performer of an action. He calls this, here's his terminology, a unified common intersubjective space, a we-centric space, which has a shared implicit semantic content. This shared informational space acts as a control model in a forward movement way for behavior and relationships, not only with objects, but with other agents. He suggests that such joint shared bodily experience extends beyond grasping actions implicit with or simulated by mirror neurons to the experience of emotions and sensations such as pain. What does this mean? It seems to imply that within such a metaphorical space, this is metaphorical language, persons share cognitive experience through the shared parallel actions of their neural systems. And in the process, they experience a self-other identity that grounds an intersubjective certitude that other people are intentional agents like themselves, and that we can know their intentions. Now, Galacy has to be operating on a very basic level of what can be known, but he makes very bold and sweeping claims. Anytime we meet someone, we do not just perceive that someone to be, broadly speaking, similar to us. We are implicitly aware of this similarity because we literally embody it. Our neurons are firing in such a way that we physically experience their likeness. And he goes on to invoke phenomenologists to talk about the other person being another self, having a participatory identity. He also says that we then have the capacity not only to mind read, to experience other people's behavior and understand its content and predict its consequences, but also to attribute intentions to other individuals. These are astounding assertions, raising questions not only about potential distinctions between understanding another and projecting ourselves onto them, but also about the boundaries of the self and the negotiation of difference as well as similarity. Now, Galacy does not dispute the importance of difference, but he claims self-other identity preexists and further parallels the self-other dichotomy. That is, at the very beginning of life, prior to our experience of ourselves as conscious subjects of our own lives, there is a, quote, primitive self-other space, a paradoxical form of intersubjectivity without subjects. Consequently, intersubjective relations play a major and constitutive role in shaping our cognitive capacities and in providing the shared database required to establish meaningful bonds with other individuals. In such a space, then, personal action would be action done by such relationally constituted intersubjective agents. It's not characterized by autonomy or self-determination. It is the action of an agent that is, at bottom, an agent constructed in relationship, constituted relationally. Okay, raises lots of questions about identity, freedom, responsibility, and so forth. But let's move on to Paul. Pauline anthropology is a puzzle. How does Paul understand personal action or the action of human agents? At two key places in his letters, Paul uses a very odd grammatical formulation to depict personal action. It goes like this. It is no longer I who, then you supply the verb, but blank in me. Here's those places. I, through the law, died to the law that I might live to God. A very big puzzle, certainly, but we're not going there right now. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who lives, but Christ lives in me. And the life I now live in the flesh, I live in the faith or trustworthiness of the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. That's one place. The second place, I do not understand what I'm doing, for I do not do what I want, but I do what I hate. Now, if I do what I do not want, I agree that the law is good. So then, it is no longer I who does it, but sin dwelling in me, that is, in my flesh. If I do what I do not want, it is no longer I doing it, but sin dwelling in me. It's a very odd way to speak. Would you agree? Very odd. It's puzzled people for centuries. In each case, the speaker says, I no longer am acting, but someone or something else inhabits my person as the subject of my actions. And the difference between the constructions of the self or the agent in these two passages consists in the distinctly different personally indwelling actors. On the one hand, Christ, and on the other hand, sin personified as an agent. It's very odd. Now, the actors could not be more opposed to each other, certainly in Paul's theology. But the structure of the self in these opposing pictures is remarkably similar. In both cases, the self is a self in relation to another, undermining any notion of the person as a bounded, self-determining agent in a freestanding way. This structured subjectivity is what interests me. Notably, in both texts, there is still an I that is the subject of active verbs, despite the radical claims, I have died, I no longer live, it's no longer I doing the action. Still, the I is acting. And that suggests that the person is not absorbed fully into or fully melded with the other inhabiting agent or subject that co-constitutes her actions, whether that be Christ or sin. Paul seems to assume a self-other identity in which the distinction between the self and the other is maintained, and yet their actions are fused. This is not precisely Galati's we-centric space. I cannot think, I don't know what you think, Lynn, I can't think of any biblical examples where the human agent and the divine agent are melded into a we. I don't know, we might talk about that, but I can't think of that. But still, there's this puzzling overlay of subjects in the agency depicted in each passage. Now, this is not the language that can be explained by some division within the self, although there have been many, many attempts within a Cartesian worldview to do that, to read Paul's language in that way. This is not a partial deadening of oneself, or an exercising of mastery over undesirable passions, or simply cutting oneself off from the past. It is the whole of the ego that is gone. How do we make sense of this? What keeps it from being a masochistic rejection of one's personhood? This was the question that got me into reading this in the first place in Paul, or a case of schizophrenic personality disorder. I mean, what's going on here? Because my time is short, I will just say very briefly that Pauline scholarship has tended to answer this question in two ways. One, and Rudolf Bultmann exemplifies it, says that this, for Paul, is talking about the self in relationship to itself. And the body mediates the self in relationship to the self. And this self-relation is what dominates everything else. The other comes from Ernst Käsemann, Bultmann's student, another German biblical scholar, who says that for Paul, anthropological terms don't refer primarily to the individual, but existence is always fundamentally conceived from the angle of the world to which one belongs. And for Paul, all God's ways begin and end in corporeality, in bodies. For Käsemann, what Paul means by this language is that to be a body is to be embedded in one's world and to be constrained and shaped in relationship to one's world. And so one's world, which is one's relational matrix, becomes very crucial in the kind of agent one becomes. One's agency is shaped interpersonally, unavoidably interpersonally. Let me just say very briefly, in the earlier discussion today about sort of two worlds of discourse, one is sort of a naturalistic scientific discourse. Did I just do something here? Sorry about that. Yeah, right, it was something dwelling in me. No, and the other, the sort of the theological discourse. I found myself thinking of Alex Alistair McIntyre's talking about how do two different worlds of discourse communicate or not, and how they are embedded in interpretive communities of discourse and practice that have and narratives. All of that is part of the discourse that we have to take into account when we try to understand what's going on in Paul and what's going on actually in the neuroscientific theories as well. So how does this help us? Here's the issue. If we take the understanding of the person as a person in relation to relational matrices that may be in conflict with each other, and we think about that as in some way constituting personal agency and shaping it profoundly, then when a person is disconnected from one, radically severed from one relational matrix, that self, thus co-constituted, ceases, is done away with. When Paul talks about his relationally constituted self being done away with in this radical metaphor of death and life, he's talking about the severance of a whole self that is constituted in a relationship to a community and a set of practices and a narrative that he is now no longer in relationship with or in a complex relationship with. And so then if he talks about a new self, it is a self that is constituted in relationship to a new community of practice, narrative, and discourse. That's the idea. I have just a couple of minutes here, so I'm really jumping over a lot of stuff, but this is what I can do. Now, in both Paul and Galatians, human beings are selves in relation, but they do not therefore cease to be individuals. Paul is stronger on that individuality, by the way, than I think Galatians is. There's an interdependent relationship between the body as self-relation and the body as other relation. But in both of them, the other relation mediates and shapes the self-relation. In other words, in the development of persons as agents, which is what is interesting to me, self-knowledge begins through the lens of how we are known and perceived by others. Later, such self-knowledge may also provide a lens through which we understand others. But there's no freestanding agent or self. In other words, from both Paul and Galatians, there's this interplay between other relation and self-relation, but not an erasure of the self, nor a self that has no self-awareness at all. But self-awareness comes hand in glove with the external relations in which the person is embedded. Now, very briefly, an example of this comes from a very surprising source. I've been reading a fair amount about autism. Autism is usually the sort of put up as the example of the exception to the rule that we're interrelational, interpersonally constructed. But in a survey of actual memoirs and statements by autistic people, there are many times in which they describe no lack of motivation for communication, but a proprioceptive failure in their bodies to be able to be aware of their bodies and to make their bodies do what they want them to do. So for example, one autistic guy who's written this, well, a lot of fabulous books, one called How Can I Talk When My Lips Don't Move? Tito Mukhopadhyay. He says that he rocks back and forth so that he can feel his body. He doesn't have an innate proprioceptive loop. So he needs to have something to supply that. He cannot make his lips move by himself. But what happens is that in the physical interaction with his mom, who will pat him on the back, she pats him on the back and it makes him breathe. Then he is able to talk. He learned to talk by his mother patting him on the back so that he could feel his mouth and his breath, and then he could talk. I'm not saying this is true of all autistics, but there are other accounts too where the capacity for personal action by the autistic happens in the interpersonal, embodied interaction with others who help them to be able to be aware of their bodies and do what they want with their bodies. This is a wonderful picture of how embodied connection and self-other relation facilitates self-awareness and personal agency. The autistic is still an agent. This is their action. And yet it is an action that is interpersonally constituted. How might this help us think about how human and divine personal action might be related as well? I don't have time to talk about that much, but I will say that divine-human interaction assumes both a degree of similarity between God and humanity, but also a degree of difference. And we find this certainly in Paul's convictions here, but also, of course, in Jewish and Christian traditions elsewhere. Both the similarity of being created in the divine image and yet the radical otherness of God that is absolutely crucial for both theological traditions. And that radical otherness as well as the similarity creates a kind of intersubjective agency in which the agency of one is not absorbed into the agency of the other, but there's a co-constitution. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.